Welcome to Never Again is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. I am Evelyn Marcus, and in addition to being a psychologist, I am featured in the documentary about anti-Semitism, Never Again is Now. I am a Dutch Jew and the daughter of Holocaust survivors. In 2006, I immigrated to the United States because of the rising anti-Semitism in Europe.
I am Phyllis Zimbler Miller. I was born in a small town and grew up in the Midwest, where our grandparents and great-grandparents had come at the turn of the century before to get away from the Tsar and other anti-Semitic incidents in Eastern Europe. But in 1970, my US Army officer husband and I were stationed in Munich, Germany, only 25 years after the end of World War II. This changed our lives forever.
Michal Bilewicz is an associate professor of psychology and the director of the Center for Research on Prejudice at the University of Warsaw, Poland. His main research interests concern reconciliation, anti-Semitism, dehumanization, and linguistic social psychology. From 2005 to 2006, he was a Fulbright scholar at the New School for Social Research in New York. In 2015, he received the National Science Center Award in the Humanities, Social Sciences, and the Arts. Michal, welcome to our show. We're thrilled to have you on.
Thank you for this invitation. I'm honored to take part in this podcast on the topic which I find highly relevant, unfortunately highly relevant in our times globally, but particularly so in the Eastern Europe where I work.
Yes, so we don't know that much about Eastern Europe, and we hope to learn more from you today. So first, maybe a more personal question. Why did you make the choice to focus your research on prejudice, anti-Semitism, dehumanization, and reconciliation?
I don't think that this is such a surprising choice of research topic for a researcher who was raised in a Jewish family or a mixed Jewish, non-Jewish family in Poland, where we have a feeling of living on the ashes, of living on a place which used to be one of the largest Jewish communities in the world. And after the Holocaust, there are just a few thousand of remaining members of the Jewish community in a country where a Jewish community was counted in millions rather than in thousands of people. And in a place where we see not only the remnants of these communities, cemeteries, abandoned synagogues, mikvahs, and all of these places, they are in the environment, but of course they are abandoned. There are no people there, and from time to time you see young people, Christian Poles, who are discovering this history and exploring it, being fascinated by that. But then on the other hand, you also have those large proportion of the society of people who are anti-Semitic, even at the absence of Jews in the country. So this creates a situation that's worth investigation for scientists, especially social scientists, who enters this this area. And this is probably how I became interested in those problems. And of course, the history of the Holocaust as a prominent example of dehumanization, of stereotyping and prejudice, and the genocide, which is a consequence of those psychological processes. This is something that inspires much of my research interests, and I think that what I study today is very much inspired by my thinking about what happened here in Poland during the Holocaust.
I see. So it's a very natural choice of topics in the environment where you live, given the history there and the current anti-Semitism still being there, even now when there are no Jews, hardly any Jews around, right?
Let's growing up, you said you come from a mixed Jewish and non-Jewish family. Did you know about the Holocaust? How did it affect your growing up in terms of your own family story? If you'd like to share your family survival story with us, that would be fine.
Yeah, I don't think that the term survival is an absolutely accurate story in terms of my family. One of my grandmothers, in her case, it was indeed a story of survival because she escaped the ghetto in Lvov, and she was raised in Kolomea in what is today Ukraine, and used to be Galicia, part of Poland before the war. And she escaped the ghetto, and with her whole family killed in Bełżec's death camp. She was the only person who survived on false documents on the so-called Aryan side in Warsaw, pretending to be a Gentile, pretending to be non-Jewish. And this is the story, her story, that she didn't tell much about that because it was so traumatic. She was very enthusiastic about telling her pre-war stories and telling about our family history and the rabbis that we were, that our ancestors were, and so on. Like the story of Kolomea and of our family in Kolomea was something we talked about a lot in my childhood with her, but she almost never taught anything about the Holocaust. This was not something she wanted to talk about. She refused to give her testimony to Spielberg's Shoah archives. So this is the story of one part of my family. I had another great grandfather who survived the war, being in Romania, where it was actually somewhat easier for Jewish people to survive because he was not sent to Transnistria. He was in Chernovtsi. He was quite wealthy. He had Chilean passport, which was a way, a strategy to somehow have some sense of safety in these worst years in Romania. And then when the Soviets entered, he joined the Red Army, and this was his story. He was never like with his Chilean passport and quite good financial situation. He survived the war without too many turbulences. And I have also another story from my second grandfather, who was also the question whether it was survival. He was actively resisting. So he was part of the Jewish resistance. He was one of the fighters of the Białystok ghetto. So he was fighting. He was member of the resistance, communist resistance in the Białystok ghetto, and then he left the ghetto just before the uprising started. He left to the forest and he joined a partisan unit, and he was actively fighting Germans during the war. Although he lost his family, he lost his wife and daughter, and remarried Christian wife, my second grandmother, after the war. So this is the mixture of different faiths during the war, and also whenever I think about it, there is a lot of psychology there and different reactions that they faced from the Polish environment, from the Germans, ranging from righteousness and support to betrayal and hatred. So I think it's a very important inspiration for us to think about the society today and the variability of people's moral behavior in different situations.
Thank you for sharing that. We appreciate it.
According to the Anti-Defamation League, 48% of the Polish population is anti-Semitic, which is the highest percentage in Eastern Europe and twice as high as in Western Europe, 5 times as high even as in the United States. What do you think are the reasons that so many people in Poland are anti-Semitic?
I think there are several reasons for these differences in the results between Poland, or first of all, between Eastern Europe and the West. Here, I think there's a big, the big issue behind those differences is the question of social desirability or political correctness, which shapes people's responses in opinion polls, in surveys. We know that in America, the problem is way larger than we get it from such reports from surveys. We know that in the Western Europe, the problem is really significant. And there was a number of attacks on Jewish institutions, and the perception of hostility from the environment among Jewish population is rather high. I was engaged in the large research project organized by Fundamental Rights Agency, comparing, this was a survey of Jewish populations in different countries in Europe. And in almost all countries that we have studied, majority of Jewish populations perceive the situation to be worsening and perceives the anti-Semitism to be growing in those countries. So I wouldn't say that the situation is so good in the Western Europe and it's so tragic in the Eastern Europe. The problem is that in the Eastern Europe, people are openly expressing their anti-Semitic views. So when they are talking to pollster or completing the questionnaire, they feel it's not something to be ashamed of. And this is the big problem, and the big problem, especially in our region. Probably this could be attributed to lack of democracy and censorship during the communist era. And after the collapse of communism, people thought, now this is time when we can openly express any view and nobody can constrain anything what we think. And this is the moment when people started expressing anti-Semitism in a very blatant way, differently from the Western Europe, where it was more of a taboo issue. People could be anti-Semitic, but not express it publicly. So this is one difference. But also there are other historical differences. And first of all, the relations between the non-Jewish Poles before the war and Jews or Jewish Poles before the war, there was a conflict already then. And we know the history of pogroms and the history of sort of competition in the labor market between the people who were traders, who were shopkeepers. Of course, there was a competition between the traditionally, these were professions that were traditionally Jewish in those countries of Eastern Europe and Poland. And since the beginning of the 20th century, more and more Poles were leaving villages, leaving rural areas, and trying to enter the job market in the cities, become also craftsmen, or getting into commerce, things that their ancestors have never been doing. It was also a tabooized thing for Christians. And this was the starting point, that there was this competition, and they needed some good justification in this competition. And anti-Semitic became a very, very easy way to express their hostility against in this competition. And of course, there was another source of that was Christianity and Roman Catholicism, in which didn't make it very different, the Polish situation, from any other country in the region, because also here Jew was the proximal other for Christians, yes, those who did not believe in Jesus, who did not join this religious movement, and therefore Christianity was always fueling anti-Semitism in the region very much. So these are some peculiarities that are maybe some of them are more typical for Eastern Europe, some of them are more typical for Poland, some of them not. And of course, the history of the Holocaust and the question of behavior during the Holocaust, or misbehavior of large proportion of Polish population, who some of them, I mean, Poland never create a collaborationist state. So it was very different from, let's say, Norway or France with Vichy regime, or Hungary with the Arrow Cross movement. There was never a collaborationist state during the Nazi occupation, but it didn't make the attitudes of Poles towards Jews any better. So there was an underground movement and an underground state, but this state was somehow trying to exclude Jews from the future Poland. So there were some organized actions within the Polish underground state to help Jews, but at the same time, there were many parts of the Polish resistance that were openly anti-Semitic, that were killing Jews during the war. For example, from the testimonies of my grandfather and his comrades who were Jewish partisans, we know that they were equally afraid of Germans and of Polish underground when they were fighting in those forests and trying to survive in the forests of eastern Poland and Belarusia. So the history is very complicated here, and much of the anti-Semitism is fueled by problems related to this Holocaust history, which is a history of bystandership, of passivity, of lack of compassion in many cases, and sometimes even crimes against Jews. And we have more and more historical discoveries pointing to those crimes during the war.
And maybe that's relevant too, a history of incredible suffering of the Polish population during World War II. Maybe that has an influence too on that.
Very much so. The competition of victimhood, and I think this is a topic which I wanted to discuss in a more extensive way, because again, this is not specific for Poland, but we see in all studies that we've been conducting in Poland that those people who believe in, who consider their nation to be unique in their suffering, so who are very much focused on the suffering of Poland, those people, among those people, we observe the highest levels of anti-Semitism, because Jews are obvious competitors in the status of who is the prototype of the victim. And again, this is not unique to Poland. We've been studying with our colleagues those problems very recently in Hungary, in Slovakia, and we see the same. Those people who think their nation was the unique victim in the history, they would consider also Jews, they would deny Jewish suffering, and they would be the most anti-Semitic in the whole population. And a very interesting studies conducted by Laura de Guismet in Belgium among Congolese immigrants showed the same in Belgium, that those Congolese immigrants who have never met any Jewish person in their home country, from which they migrated to Belgium, while living in Belgium, they you can find high levels of anti-Semitism among them. Why is it so? Because they realized that the history of the genocide of Congolese people committed by Belgians has not been properly addressed, and they think we are not commemorated because the Holocaust is always acknowledged so much. So all those situations where people believe that the acknowledgement of the Holocaust is a zero-sum game. If the Holocaust is recognized, we will not be recognized. So in case of Poland, for example, the tragedy that happened in Katyń, where Polish soldiers were killed, thousands of Polish soldiers were killed by the Soviets, or other tragedies, the massacres during Warsaw Uprising, not the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, but the Warsaw Uprising in 1944. Again, I'm quite sure that many of our listeners have never heard about those crimes. So among many Poles, there is a sense of not being properly acknowledged, and this might be a stepping stone for anti-Semitism. If we are not acknowledged, then those who are acknowledged become obvious enemies. So this is why I think it is very essential that we should talk about those other crimes. And I don't think that the fact that we commemorate the Holocaust would make those crimes any less salient or discussed in the public discourse.
I find it a very plausible but also well underpinned finding, and also it makes me think of the woke movement today in the United States or in Western Europe, where there is no room anymore for seeing the suffering of Jews, because, and the argument is that the suffering of other groups would not get enough room if the Jews start to talk about being vulnerable. So that's shut off from wokeism, so to speak. Anyway, that was my association with what you just said. Phyllis.
Yes, well, in a way, you answered my next question, which is about the Anti-Defamation League survey said 74% of Polish people think Jews still talk too much about what happened to Jews in the Holocaust. And in a way, you explained it. But I want to say something, because I've been reading since the lockdown quite a bit of history, Polish history. I read Jan Karski's book. Did I pronounce his name correctly? It's called The Underground State. I think.
Yes.
Okay. And we know about the Holocaust in America, and we know which countries many of us were invaded. But really, Hitler thought the Poles were just a little bit above the Jews. He also considered them Untermenschen, and he wanted their land, and therefore they had to be gone. So your explanation does really resonate with me, because I understand that the Poles may feel that they are not given, I don't want to say a share of history, but an appreciation of history, of how much they were to be wiped out. And yes, I do know about the Warsaw Uprising. That's after the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, as the Soviets were approaching Warsaw. Am I saying this correctly? And they thought the Soviets would come and help, and instead the Soviets stayed on the other side of whichever river, you want to tell me which river, and waited for the Poles to kind of die in the attempt before the Russians came in. So I agree that we need to look more completely at the history, but I don't know that it still really explains anti-Semitism in Poland. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, this history, I mean, the scale of trauma and the traumatization of Poles during the war is something which I agree it's not properly acknowledged globally. When you think about the suffering of non-Jewish Poles, we are talking about 10% of the population of the country, excluding Jewish Poles. So only among ethnic Poles, 10%, so 1 person in 10 would be killed or would die or would suffer or would die because of war sufferings during those 5 years of the Second World War in Poland. So this is massive. I mean, losing 10% of a population it's hard to understand, hard to imagine that. Now, of course, it's uncomparable to the fate of Polish Jews, because among Polish Jews, the proportion was the reverse. It was 90% of those who were killed and only 10% who survived. So again, these numbers, you can, when you make this comparison, of course, the tragedy and the suffering of Jews is way higher. But when you look at objective numbers, the numbers are relatively similar, because it's in the amount of the, so it's about 3 million of non-Jewish Poles who were killed during the Second World War and the Nazi occupation, and it's approximately 3 million of Polish Jews who were killed in that time. So here you can say maybe this is comparable, and this is an ongoing issue in the Polish-Jewish relations today, how to discuss about these problems. And in many opinion polls, this question has been asked: what do you think? Who did suffer more during the Holocaust? Did Jews suffer more? Did Poles suffer more? Or did both nations suffer the same? And when you look at the responses to that in opinion polls, in early 1990s, in 1992, a vast majority of participants in those studies in Poland would say Jews suffered more. Because at that time, many people remembered, they have seen, they have witnessed And even if they were very anti-Semitic, they knew what happened. Now, year after year, the number of people who say Jews suffered more is decreasing. And the number of people who say both groups suffered the same or Polish people suffered more, this group is increasing in time. And today, the dominant response is both groups suffered the same. So both Jews and Poles suffered the same during the Nazi occupation. So you can see the growing ignorance, which is, first of all, the reason for that is lack of proper historical education. And in Poland, historical education is very biased. It excludes the Jewish topics. The Holocaust education is almost absent. Holocaust is mostly taught through the narrative of righteousness and Polish and the rescue actions and Polish heroism, but not much is being taught about the fate of Jews, a part of those stories of rescue. So there are big problems here, and I do not deny the problem, the scale of the Polish suffering. And I don't know, in Zamość area, Polish children were kidnapped from their families and being given to German families, because the aim of the Nazis was to colonize this part of Poland and to make it purely German and to assimilate those Polish children. I mean, there are absolutely genocidal events. But of course, if you compare them to Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Bełżec and Sobibór, they seem not to count so much. So this is the problem, which I think is which I think should be addressed. And I in my dreams, I sometimes really can imagine the situation in which both Jewish diaspora and Jews in Israel are acknowledging this history of Poland, and Poles are becoming more open to the fact that the Jewish suffering was specific, that Holocaust was unique. And this is something which has to be made absolutely, has to be expressed very openly. And as long as we cannot talk about this uniqueness of the Holocaust, then it is a distortion of the history. And this is what we are hearing in Poland almost all the time from politicians, from people responsible for education. They are distorting the Holocaust by denying the fact of the uniqueness of Jewish suffering.
Thank you. That's very interesting information. I think I have to think about that because it's really important. Evelyn?
Is the anti-Semitism in Poland today, is it verbal, physical, or socially excluding Jews? Does it come from the left, the right, religion?
As I said, the Jewish population in Poland is not more than 10,000 people. So when we think about, the open violence against Jewish people, it's not really targeting the highly assimilated Jewish population in Poland. So this is probably not the case. There is not there were some single acts of, there was an attack against the Polish rabbi approximately 20 years ago already. There was burning of the doors of the Jewish synagogue in Poland. We hear about numerous such incidents at Jewish cemeteries, where Jewish cemeteries are being desecrated, and you can see some anti-Semitic graffiti on the walls, and also sometimes being put on the Jewish tombstones and matzevot at the cemeteries. So these things happen in Poland, but they are rarely active acts of violence. So, like shootings, synagogue shootings. These are things that we didn't witness, Baruch Hashem, in Poland until now. But on the other hand, the problem remains. But the problem is the problem of anti-Semitism is in Poland more about this illusory Jew or imaginary Jew. So these are conspiracy beliefs about Jewish control over politics, Jewish control over economy, Jewish plot against Poland, Jewish organizations that are trying to get material compensations and have claims against Poland, and so on and so on. So these different conspiracy theories, they are omnipresent. We hear them from the governing party in Poland, so they are not on the fringe of the politics, they are in the mainstream of the politics. We hear them from, we can read about them, we can see them on the cover of well-selling newspapers and journals. So this is the reality. And in the study that I mentioned here already, the study that we've done with the Fundamental Rights Agency, we found that for the well-being of Jewish communities, it's not only the fear of violence, which is important, but also the general atmosphere. So the hate speech, which you hear in everyday life, can be as threatening as real violence. And this is one of the main motivators for Jewish people to consider emigration from the country. It's the hate speech, it's this atmosphere, the atmosphere that we are not welcome, that we are not being considered equal citizens with other citizens. And this is something which is a big problem in Poland. When we are doing studies of that problem, we almost always see that it's politically skewed to the right. So this is the problem of the right wing, not of the left wing. But in Poland, the right wing dominates. So in Poland, the governing party today is a nationalistic populist party. They have opposition, which is on one hand right-wing extremists, on the other hand, let's say liberal conservatives. So most of the politics is skewed to the right. The Social Democratic Party is rather small. It's approximately 10% of the electorate of the left-wing party is approximately 10 to 15%, not more. So most of the Polish politics is on the right, and the liberal conservative party is not anti-Semitic. The nationalistic populist party, the one which forms the Polish government, is I would say that many of their speeches and many of their activities reveal that they spread those anti-Semitic conspiracy beliefs, conspiracy theories. And there is also this right-wing extremist party which is pushing them from the right. Their popularity, they have also their electorate is 5 to 10%, not very much, but they set the agenda in terms of anti-Semitism, and they create this anti-Semitic discourse, which then the governing party is picking from that point. So yes, in Poland, we almost always find a very strong correlation of political ideology with anti-Semitism. So it's clearly on the right. It's clearly related to nationalist right-wing views. When it comes to religion, the correlations are usually very weak. So we don't see religion to be a primary factor of anti-Semitism today. And of course, it's due to the fact that we have two different, in fact, although more than 90% of Poles are Roman Catholics, there are two different churches when it comes to the Jewish, to the question of attitudes toward Jews. So there are those who follow the legacy of Pope John Paul II, who was Polish and who made very large progress in terms of Christian-Jewish dialogue. So the followers of this church, many of them are conservative. They are conservative Christians. They are not, I would not call them, many of them, I would not call them, liberals in the church. But many of them are conservative, but still they are following the teaching of John Paul II. At the same time, there is another voice in the Catholic Church which is highly anti-Semitic, and it's mostly connected to the Catholic Radio Maria, which is the we have a radio station which is very widely broadcasted in the country, which used to spread conspiracy beliefs, also anti-Semitic conspiracy beliefs. And it's also part of the Catholic Church. And many bishops are followers of this radio. Polish government is very much inspired by this radio and connected to it, and they are often invited to speak in this radio. So this is the source of anti-Jewish hatred. This used to be for many years the source of anti-Jewish hatred in Poland.
Thank you. Everything that you say is so enlightening to someone in the West about what's going on in Poland. I can't thank you enough. And so we don't have that much time left, but I really do want to ask you these two questions that are kind of connected. You studied the difficulties in teaching school children about the Holocaust. Could you quickly tell us what are the difficulties, and also, is it effective to take school children to Auschwitz? How do they react? What do they learn?
Actually, many Polish school children go to Auschwitz, visit Auschwitz, for many reasons, because it's important to note also that Auschwitz, except of being a death camp, a major death camp where Jews were killed, was also a very important concentration camp.
Yes.
Where many Poles were killed, and some of them survived. So we have many stories and testimonies of the survivors from Auschwitz. One of the Polish post-war prime ministers was a survivor from Auschwitz. More recently, a Polish minister of foreign affairs, Władysław Bartoszewski, was also another survivor from Auschwitz. So those memories are shared in many families. So it's also an important part of those Polish martyrdom during the Second World War. So yes, Polish children visit, Polish students visit Auschwitz. The problem is that many of them visit Auschwitz too early, because as many of us are aware of the March of the Living and of the Israeli tours to visit Auschwitz, and those tours are usually taking place, those students who go to visit Poland and visit death camps, they do that when they are 17, 18 years old, so they are more mature. In Poland, in many cases, these are 12, 13 years old children who are visiting Auschwitz, and I think this is too early, and they're not prepared well and to comprehend those, those very traumatic stories. We've been studying visits to Auschwitz recently more intensively, and we found that for many young Poles, it's a very traumatic experience, and we found that approximately 13% of those young visitors to Auschwitz end with a secondary post-traumatic stress disorder, so with real mental health problem. So 1 month after, we really observed that in 1 in 10 people, young people who visit Auschwitz, we found problems with like sleep disorders, hypervigilance, intrusive thoughts, and all of those problems, that mental health problems that we observe normally among survivors of disasters or war veterans. So this was very upsetting to me, and particularly we found that among those young people who highly empathized with the Jewish suffering, so those who really were so shocked by what they have seen. So this is why I think it's very essential that we should prepare students much better to those visits, because in case of Polish visits to Auschwitz, they're unprepared. It's just, they are usually going for a trip to Krakow to visit salt mines in Wieliczka, and then on the way back, they just jump to Auschwitz for 3 hours, and then they come back to their hometowns. And this is very problematic because there is no work around that. There is no real the psychological counseling to them after what they have seen. And I think that even good teacher can become such a counselor and help in that. So this is one problem. I see another problem with the Jewish tours to Auschwitz. So both the March of the Living and Israeli visitors coming to Poland, because usually these are 1-week visits that are focused predominantly on the Holocaust. So it's visiting Treblinka, Auschwitz, Warsaw Ghetto, Krakow Ghetto, and Płaszów, yes, and Majdanek. If you combine that in 1 week, it's also a massive traumatization, but at the same time, it's also lack of contact with the Poland of today. So they have no chance, most of them have no chance to visit, to meet young people of their age, to see Poland, which is a vibrant country, a new modern country, and they come back with the impression that this is the country of the Holocaust, and that's it. So we have seen that there is, we've done one such study comparing the level of the attitudes of Israelis toward Poland and Poles towards Israel and Israelis. And we found that actually Poles are more open to Israelis than the Israelis are against Poles. So there's a highly negative attitudes among Israelis against Poland today. So I think there is also much to be done in that respect, also to acknowledge the fact that we have political leaders who are obviously anti-Semitic, but it doesn't mean that the whole population, that the whole society is anti-Semitic. And as I said in the beginning of this podcast, there is, I know many young people in Poland who are exploring the Jewish history, who are preserving Jewish cemeteries in their hometowns, who are trying to commemorate the Jewish communities in their hometowns, who are proud of the Jewish history of the towns in which they live. And I think this is very important. This is something that needs to be promoted, that needs to be supported. And the activities, for example, there's the Forum for Dialogue Foundation, which brings together those people all around Poland who are trying to preserve the Jewish history. Usually these are teachers, these are librarians, these are sometimes people who are completely, they have no professional connection to that. They do that in their free time, in their as the kind of a mission that they have. A mission to preserve the Jewish history when at the absence of Jewish communities in those towns today. So something like that happens, and I hope that those people will set that they will frame the general way of treating those topics and those issues in Poland, rather than those populist politicians that try to fearmonger, to spread conspiracy theories against Jews. And I think this is a clash that we have today between the civic society and people who want to make some difference in this, and on the other hand, politicians who are trying to stop that process and to limit that. And very recently, they banned the presence of many educational organizations in schools. So they don't want, the government doesn't want also Holocaust education institutions to enter Polish schools, because they are aware that as long as the students will have a proper Holocaust education, as long as they will become inspired to explore Jewish history, they will not become an electorate of those populist nationalist parties.
You have go a bit, Evelyn, because we're running near the end. So I think we should go.
I'm learning personally, I'm learning two important lessons from you. One is when we discuss anti-Semitism, not to overlook the suffering of people in the audience or people we're discussing it with. That in my mind, you cannot measure suffering. Every suffering is suffering, and it deserves to be acknowledged and heard. And also an important lesson to me is to be careful with presenting Holocaust monuments to young people, and to understand that it can have a huge psychological, emotional impact, and not to overdo it, and give them the right, support before and afterwards.
Yes.
Yeah. Evelyn, that is really well said. And Michal's call to action, there's a lot of information. I hope people really listen carefully to this particular podcast. There's a lot call to action for us in the United States also about Holocaust education and what you just said. So as our time is running out, are there any last words that you would like? Did we miss anything really important that you would like to share with us?
The really important thing is please support those individuals who are still trying to confront anti-Semitism and try to commemorate the Jewish history in Poland. They still exist. They are under high pressure from the government, from the populist nationalist forces in the Polish politics. But I hope those people will survive. But obviously, it's essential that they receive some support from people who care and who really would like Poland and other East European countries to be on the democratic side and not to go back to those, those authoritarian and dark historical episodes, because unfortunately the progression of Polish politics today is towards the more authoritarian and anti-democratic, illiberal state, which is a very upsetting thing to witness.
Yes, yes. I, as I said, I hope people really listen to this particular podcast, because there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and perhaps people outside Poland, as you pointed out, can also help people inside Poland. So thank you so much for taking the time and sharing this with us. Thank you to the listeners. I do urge everyone who hasn't yet listened, watched the Evelyn's documentary, Never Again, is now to do so. You can do it on Amazon or YouTube. And you can find out more information about my free nonfiction Holocaust theater project at thinedgeofthewedge.com, which deals with Poland, including a Polish savior and the Holocaust in Poland, kind of hitting both ends. And wherever you can, please speak up against anti-Semitism. Don't put yourself in physical harm, but do speak up when you can against anti-Semitism and hate. Thank you.